Are you a business owner looking for real advice and input? You're in the right place. From concept to launch to growth, funding, and beyond. Welcome to Startup Hustle with your hosts. One once sold a business for $150 million. The other, the author of $1 Million Bedroom. Here are your hosts of Startup Hustle, Matt DeCoursey and Matt Watson.
We're back. Another episode of Startup Hustle. Matt DeCoursey here with Sonny Sanwar, who will be sitting in for Matt Watson today. Sonny, what's up?
Not too much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad you came in. We're going to talk about some interesting stuff. Before we get started, I need to let everyone know that this episode of Startup Hustle is brought to you by Fullscale.io. Also, if you are feeling squirrely, you can head on over to YouTube and watch the video portion of this, or check us out on Instagram at Startup Hustle Podcast. So as we get into today's episode, Sonny is the founder and CEO of Dynamhex. And you know, we love it when you're interactive. So pay attention for the spelling here. We want you to go to dynamhex.com, Dynamhex.
That's right.
So Sonny, let's talk about what you do, man. This is some climate change startup action.
Absolutely. I think, things have been heating up on the climate change side.
Literally.
And, companies are out there trying to solve, do their part and try to help solve things. So enterprises, corporations, cities, small businesses, they're all equally affected. And sometimes they want to know what they could do. And that's where we come in. With Dynamhex, we kind of show them the full suite of options they have available to them. We engage with their own data in terms of their consumption of different resources, electricity, natural gas, if they have fleet vehicles, all the things that they deal with on a day-to-day basis. We ingest all that data and we show them their impact. We show them what are optimal options on how to decarbonize, how to react to different climate risks. And it's been very, an interesting journey. We're a young company, but we've worked with a few cities and a few companies, and they're understanding now that they have a lot of opportunities, and they actually want to do the right thing, and we just show them how.
Sure, and just to give a little background, you're currently involved with the city of Kansas City and some suburban areas around it, and also good old DC. So, climate change is obviously, it's a hot topic. It's something that's been discussed, and, you look at something that is this global issue, and, no matter where you stand on the politics of this, it's here and it's happening, and it has the ability to have a profound effect on world economics and so many other things. And, like with my own background, I've spent a lot of time watching this. I think it started like 20 years ago when I was in college. I wrote a paper on sustainability, and I was like, oh, wow, and it's something that, oh man, I don't think we were doing a whole lot about, but maybe we are. And, the solutions to one problem present another set of problems that need to be solved, and that's what you're trying to help some of these folks balance out. Is that correct?
Exactly. Just look at the full set of options available, how they're interrelated, what you have the ability to work on, what you may not have structural ability to do things with. So I think companies, they understand, like you said, sustainability. It's huge, right? It's big. It's now folks in finance are now getting into this entire topic, and it's made it very real for companies and organizations. So, they really want simplification of what they can do. They're not going to spend quarters, thinking about a problem. We just have to make it palatable for them. We have to make it quick and easy, just kind of, like a dashboard. Be like, okay, here's everything you deal with. Here are your options. If you do this, this is what's going to happen. And they appreciate it. They're like, okay, well, now it's not a global problem. It's something that I can take a bite out of.
Well, you look at something that is a global issue, but there's not a silver bullet solution that's going to fix any of it. And then it's, anytime you want to get to some solutions, you have to work backwards.
Yeah.
You say, this is where we want to be. Now let's go backwards, and we got to break it down into a bunch of little bite-sized pieces. Yep. And you talk about this is a complex problem, but there are a bunch of simple answers that when pieced together will at least make a dent in this. And that's where we're trying to go. So, you mentioned before we started recording and we sat down and talked for a couple minutes that over the last couple decades, climate change hasn't been something that startups have focused on. Yeah. So are you seeing that changing?
Yeah, I think the mantra of startups is that you figure out customer pain points, and a decade ago, I don't think customers really had the dictionary to like say what those pain points were. But now, in present day, you see a lot of climate risks and people having backlashes in terms of their brand and what it represents. So now, in modern days, it's been easier for startups to, it's no longer a latent need. It's a very public need, and startups were able to really understand what the customer problems were and create solutions targeted towards them.
So when you talk about a brand, you're talking about, like, for example, there might be a company that's making, I know this isn't necessarily climate change related, but it is ecological, like a company that, it could be a company that's putting a lot of had a massive carbon footprint, and how that's now reacted to. Is that
right?
Is that?
Yeah. So a company, for instance, one of our clients, their main thing was, okay, I understand this is how much I emit, but where am I in the industry average?
Right.
And we looked at, and you're actually like in the bottom quartile. So you're actually doing better than most of your industry peers, both in your sector and in your region. And then they're like, okay, well, that gives me some context as to what my footprint means. I know it's a lot, but is it a lot compared to GM, or is it
Sure.
a lot compared to like a small B Corp or something, right? So that context allows them to kind of frame it internally to their managers, be like, hey guys, this is where we are, this is where we want to be, and this tool tells us how to get there.
It's a different kind of problem that we're trying to solve here, because you talk about, you just mentioned that a startup has to, it solves customer pain points. These aren't necessarily, like, these are customer pain points, but not in the traditional sense that capitalism represents. And that's the thing, is as capitalism has the ability to very quickly and firmly solve specific problems when there's a financial upside. And the financial upside here is being able to actually continue to financially do anything, because certain things fall apart, it's a problem. So as far as the for-profit nature goes of this, like, that's where it's a struggle. That's got, so you just mentioned, we're talking company X here, and they say, where do I sit on the carbon footprint roadmap? And you say, well, I'm in the bottom quarter, and it might be easy for them to say, well, we're not really part of the problem. And the problem, I think, is that these companies look at this as an expense.
It really is a cost of doing business for them. They're like, well, we have to, so we're at least not where we thought we were, or there are better places we could be. I think to your earlier point about capitalism solving problems when we can measure what our outcomes should be, I think we're just breaking the surface of measurable climate impact. Like, there are accounting frameworks out there now, and there's people being trained to handle those accounting problems. So people, at least a subset of companies that are big polluters or high footprint, do understand and spend a lot of resources internally to manage and measure. And all we're doing them is giving them a tool, and it isn't unlike like a fintech product at that point. I know it's climate change, but for them it's just an organizational KPI. It's getting their internal managers on the same page, and it is to kind of market out externally to their stakeholders that here's where we are, here's what we're doing. So climate change itself is a starting point, but we very quickly distill it down to an organizational level KPI that they can understand and wrap their heads around, something that we can measure, and something that now looks a lot like an enterprise SaaS model, right? It's not. So
how much of this is up to private industry to solve, and how much of it is just pending deadlines that are coming up from regulatory changes? Looking at the data, it's actually very private sector driven at this point. Some of the top-down kind of political changes, regulations, and landscape shifts have been. There's been quite a lag. There's a lot of interest. There's legislation, but the impacts don't get felt till like 5 to 10 years downstream. The 7,500 electric vehicle federal tax credit, that didn't really induce a bunch of car companies to start up. They're already there making products before that kind of helped the consumers pull that product from the marketplace. So
Similarly, government relations kind of set the tone, but companies are the actual ones that are doing stuff on the ground. And a lot of the emissions that you've seen, in America at least, were investor-owned utilities who are like, you know what, solar and wind is cheaper, there's storage available now, why don't we create a new project and see how it, I mean, coal is not cost effective anymore, right?
Sure.
So it's from an economic standpoint, companies find those options easier to switch to, not just on the basis of climate change, but on the basis of pure economics.
So we're here in the state of Kansas. For those of you listening around the world, and Kansas, right in the middle of the United States, has the second most wind of any state, right behind Texas. And that's something that, 10 years ago, it was almost embarrassing how little wind energy Kansas was producing. Mm-hmm. And there's been it's been a focal point. Yeah. And, something that, you can start, you see some of these countries in Europe that are on full levels of sustainability when it comes to like wind.
Yeah.
And these are the things that now, where I'm going with this is, you talk about we want to replace cars with electric vehicles, but much as I mentioned earlier, there's an issue, like sometimes one solution creates a different problem.
Yeah.
Well, the amount of energy that an electric car runs is sometimes more than your home.
Absolutely.
And so now all of a sudden, if we all instantly switched, like literally instantly switched tomorrow, we would have a completely different set of problems.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's almost like onboarding neighborhoods on a day-to-day basis. You build peaker plants like left and right.
Yeah, I never really thought about that recently. We were talking to one of the cohorts that was selected from the Launch KC Clean Tech initiative, and they were helping. Like their business is based around helping solve the potential electric grid problems that would come up, and I'd never really even thought about that, because it's easy to say, man, we should all switch to electric cars. Well, those have to be charged.
Yeah.
They have to be plugged in, and then like it's a whole nother like strain.
Exactly.
And on by the way, on an electric grid that is not exactly current.
Right.
Like wow, that's a pun. But I mean, it's not. It's something that and you look at how climate change is also affecting things like the electric power grid. So California literally has built power plants that exist only for the reason of being turned on during peak electric times in the summer when it's hot.
Right. And that's a great example of what you were talking about earlier, like what solutions are very interconnected, and the way the options work is it's if it's sequenced one after the other. For instance, let's decarbonize the grid and then put a bunch of electric cars out, right? That is a different footprint than let's put the electric cars out and then decarbonize the grid. Depending on which one you do first, you have vastly different outcomes. Yeah. So knowing even that insight of how things are related, I don't think we have a full grasp on it across the economy. We could kind of think about it one-on-one, you could think about like ad hoc.
Is that something you guys help measure?
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you do that?
So so our, back engine runs, a set of inputs and outputs, and knowing the level of electrification of every end use, so like if your home uses natural gas or propane or something, that's a different set of strategies than if you have an electric heater, right? Same way if you have a fleet of like 80% diesel cars and then 20% gasoline, you have different solutions than having 100% gasoline or whatever. So those are just inputs into our model, and depending on those inputs, we suggest fuel switching. We suggest, depending on the make and model, what kind of high efficiency retrofits to consider, behavioral changes like anti-idling for fleets, for instance. So, depending on what you're looking at, if it's a facility, if it's a building, if it's a fleet, if it's a standalone generator set, what all do you have in terms of assets, and what are their impacts, and doing what when would give you what kind of an outcome. That's what our engine does.
And then there's one part of that engine that is absolutely impossible to program or deal with, and that's making people care.
Yeah.
It's true, because, as we all want to care. And then sometimes it's, and I'm not saying I'm one of these people, but it's hard. Like, it's just, sometimes as a consumer, you don't get choices. They say, we want to get all the plastic out of the ocean. Well, give me more options to not use plastic. Right. And it's, you want to be conscious and take care of that part of stuff.
Yeah.
and that's that. I think that's where it's hard. So what are you seeing in regards to other startups and the way that the economy's headed towards, when it comes to, I don't know, consumer options? I mean, you agree that you have to agree it's sometimes hard to to avoid the problem.
Absolutely. I mean, it's everywhere, right? So it's one of those daunting challenges of how do you make people care, and how do you follow through? If you do care and you do something, are you how certain could you be that has a lasting impact? Right?
Well, it's hard because you look at there's like 7 billion people on the planet. Are we up to 8?
We're pretty close.
We're getting pretty close, right?
2022 is when they cross over.
Is that when we had 8? Okay, so the paper that I wrote, I mean, it basically says, it's these things become math at some point, and the level of sustainability when it comes to our own population really starts to struggle at about 10 billion people.
Yeah.
I mean, like, it becomes hard, and you ask why. Well, you have to grow food.
Yeah.
You have to have clean water. And there's this whole trickle-down effect. And I remember, it's funny, when I was a kid, so I'm 44 years old, I remember my dad telling me, so if you're as old as I am, then at some point you went through you were a little kid and there was a fuel shortage, like lines at the fuel pumps, and just weird stuff. And I remember my dad telling me, he goes, by the time you're my age, people will fight wars over water. And it's true. Yeah. Like, they really are. Like, think about like the access to it, and some of the India and Bangladesh and some of those countries, you look at these major sources of water that flow from one place to the other. And like, I mean, now how does a city that's trying to do stuff deal with the effects of others that are around them? So you look at like the United States, and like obviously Canada or Mexico's policies would have a big effect on us. Yep. Or even in DC. So DC, one of the cities that Dynamhex is involved with, technically the District of Columbia is really small. Yeah. So it's surrounded by Virginia and Maryland. Right. So the decisions that Virginia and Maryland make are probably going to trump whatever the actual District of Columbia does, right?
Absolutely.
The District of Columbia, that I don't even think has representation in the Senate, do they? There's no senator from.
No, I don't.
Because it's not a state.
Right. They have some representation, but I don't think it's in the traditional state.
I used to live there, and at one point there was a hot topic because they had produced license plates that were like.
DC.
No, they were. God, what do they say? No taxation without representation. Like way back to like the 1700s. So how do you help? Where does that data come in? Because like I said, when you're completely surrounded, like as a country or a city or a state or an entity, like. I mean, here in Kansas City, you were talking about working with the city of Overland Park or something like that. I mean, it's just a small little blip when it comes to all the other things that are around it.
Exactly, and that's why we are working with the Metro KC Climate Action Coalition. It's basically a combination of 100 and so mayors and council members in the Metro KC, Mo, and Kansas region. And they have the same question as you, is that are we balancing each other out? Right? Is this worth doing because someone else down the street could just emit twice as more and everything we did is wiped out? And it's a fair concern. In terms of how we handle that on our product, we have a very hierarchical structure set up. So, for instance, this parcel, this tax lot, has its own emissions for the fiscal year 2019, right? This whole building. You share part of it, others are in here. It's in a city, so the city can track which parcel is emitting what component of the emissions. In the same way, the state could look down at the city and be like, Westwood is less than 1%, Overland Park is 8%, Topeka is like 14%, whatever. So they can see where it's coming from, so they could engage specific actors. In DC, we have the same thing, is we try to do an MSA level thing around, College Park, Maryland, Baltimore, and DC areas, that, okay, how could we work together? Because there's a lot of synergy, that's an upswing, but, one of the drawbacks of not working together is that we could potentially be canceling each other out. And people are looking for solutions that is more holistic and integrated, not just city by city. And that's where one of our key problem points arise for cities, is that we need to be able to benchmark against each other and make sure that we're together on the path, not just independently.
So that's something that's hard.
It is, and it's even just what I just said to you to
Like
explain that to mayors and councils.
the simple version of that was, it's really hard to get people to agree and get along.
Yep. I mean, you can give them
And
the
frustrating.
tools, but if they
Frustrating.
don't agree, yeah, it really is. But it's one of those things that, as a startup, you have to test and kind of weather the frustration just to learn what it is optimal for the company and for the product. And for us, that has led to subsetting customers, be like, okay, these are primary customers because they're okay with going through this pain point and still weathering through. Like DC, they've been just phenomenal about working together, and regardless of how complex this is, we have to put up a stand. Same with Kansas City. I was actually very surprised for the whole metro region. We had a summit, I think 2 weekends ago in Johnson County Community College, and everyone was measuring their impact. I was actually taken aback. Being in this world, I didn't really know that some of the community colleges here locally were so diligent about their footprint. So that was really refreshing and give all of us a lot of hope.
I think overall people they care, but like one of the hardest things that you probably have to deal with, or we have to deal with when facing this issue is, you have to just understand general human nature, and we do what's easiest, and like right in front of us, like the shortest path to whatever is what matters.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example. Like now, anywhere you go, I mean, pretty much universally across the United States, you'll find recycling options and different stuff like that. Now, I see a lot of press that says that they don't actually recycle a lot of that. But, so Full Scale has an office in the Philippines, and we have 175 employees there. And one of the big things that I was very adamant about was when we first opened our office there, we had about 30 people there after we hired our first 20, and we had 10 when we started. And I was on a trip over there, and I noticed that we were consuming a lot of bottled water. And so why? Well, because just realistically, you don't drink the water out of the tap.
Yeah.
And then, but we weren't recycling the bottles, and I was like, no, we're not going to do this. And I asked, and I said, well, why isn't everyone pushing to recycle this stuff? And they said, well, we're just now learning about that.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh man. So immediately we created a recycling program within our own office. Now, these are the things that this level of re-education and attainability. Now, I was just there a couple weeks ago, and I mean, things were being sorted and put in the right stuff. We also got rid of bottled water, and like, here's a cup.
Right.
Fill it up from this, this jug of water, which is purified and ready to go. And that's, so just these little things. And it's difficult to look at these solutions and say, man, my actions alone are making this massive difference. But you have to think about it, like how many grains of sand does it take to make a beach? Right. And, we're all this little tiny part. Right. So how much of your efforts go into awareness?
A lot, actually. So in the Climate Action Coalition, a lot of people were like, yeah, but, what can we do? Cities are doing great things. What could we do? And we're like, here, this is what you do. And they were just like, oh, so if I do this, it's 12% of my footprint. That's huge. I didn't even consider that. So the education.
What are a couple examples of that?
So a couple examples would be, insulation in your home if you own a home, right? So there are cost-effective ways, like less than a year payoff that you save in bills if you just invested like $85 in better insulation. No one considers that. They're like, oh, I don't have roof space with solar. It's like, hold on, let's not go to solar. Let's see in terms of efficiency and cost-effective things what you could be doing. And that was one of the biggest solution sets of the entire Kansas City like parcels, is that depending on when they were built and how they're oriented, a massive amount of savings on electricity and natural gas would come from efficiency measures. And they're all bankable, so that you could make an investment and recoup it within the end of the year. And that kind of everyone started talking about, oh, what about commercial? I have a huge space. Could we do the same thing? They're like, yeah, there's retro commissioning. People will literally come out and do audits for free and tell you what, really where you should be spending your money. So these solutions are just all ad hoc, they're just out there. They're not called climate change. They're called like property something, assessments, appraisal value, But when you bring the full suite of things together, then you're like, so that's what you meant. If I were to do this project, it would help my, operational costs, but also I show up on the system as...
Well, I'll give you an example. 6 years ago, when my wife and I moved back to Kansas City, we moved into our house. The very first thing I did was take all of the old school light bulbs out. These were like 60 and like 120 watt bulbs, and like, like you look at little goofy things like a chandelier in your entryway has like all these little bulbs, and like you start looking at them and you're like, my God, this is like a huge amount of energy, and you start replacing them. And like in the chandelier had like these little 60 watt candle bulbs in them, and you go and replace those, and those are like 6 watt or 7 watt bulbs. And now I spent $500 doing this, and some people look at that and they'll be like, dude, I'm not spending $500 on light bulbs. I haven't changed any of those bulbs 6 years later. I really haven't. And I saw an immediate dip in my electric bill.
Well, those people actually are spending $500 on
lighting. You're going to spend it one way or the other. Well, first off, I haven't had to change a light bulb in that same time period. And then also, I mean, I did notice a noticeable savings. Now I haven't really been keeping score on that. Yeah. But it was just like, I don't know, it was just bothersome.
Yeah, and great examples are Nest, right? Like that's a clean tech company.
I did that too.
Too. That's also one of behavioral things, like things that you just don't want to deal with end up costing you. Yep. There's software out there that helps you deal with it, right? So all these solutions are not necessarily, you have to care and understand, and you have to like compare your action against, a dip in the ocean. You do have products out there that are doing really well, that are helping customers solve problems. We're taking all those outcomes and reorienting it towards a wider problem.
I think one of the things too, if people don't wrap their arms around this as consumers, that if we don't do this willingly, we're going to have to be forceful about it.
Yeah, and or just the amount of risk that we have. Like Kansas City is at risk of desertification. I think the fifth most desertified city over the next decade. Those can have effect beyond what consumers...
Meaning from drought?
Yeah. From drought, so like extreme heat and the breadbasket of America.
Now some people look at that, and here in the Midwest over the last year, it's been ridiculously rainy. Yeah. And now look, that's an effect. That's a climate change. It has rained more in the last year. Like it's actually swampy and floody. Yeah. in a lot of places. My neighbor just recently earlier this year drove through Nebraska and sent me some pictures, and I was just like, holy shit! Like this stuff is like underwater.
And it's happening now. It's no longer a future problem.
No, and it's but that's part of what that matters. And some people are like, I've heard people say, oh, it's not. It's well. First off, 3 years ago here in Kansas City, there was a day in December when it was 65 degrees. I mean, it was like Christmas, and it was 65, and I was like, wow, that's warm. Yeah. That's warm. But, that all stirs things up. It creates a level of severity of storms and weather patterns that we're also not used to seeing.
And the impact it has on just day-to-day activities, like, bonds can fail if the payouts over time get affected. If properties get destroyed, which is happening in Florida and all the coasts, as a city, you don't have an avenue of recouping, debt. They can't service debt anymore. And that could affect, hospitals, schools, roads. I mean, Moody's made a big play on acquiring a startup that, a majority share of a startup that basically does visualization of climate impacts for cities, and they're using it to reevaluate ratings to see.
And the cities that are affected are big.
Absolutely.
I mean, you're looking at like New York. I mean, the majority of people live on the coast.
Yeah, and you don't know where they're going to move.
Yeah, right. It's like maybe to Kansas. Maybe it's front property in Kansas.
And one thing I do want to mention, like I'm originally from Bangladesh, and there's the biggest migration known in modern. I don't know if it's modern or
is Bangladesh the country that's like kind of going underwater in a lot of places, and that's I mentioned that earlier because and that's directly south of India.
That's east of India.
Okay, but are they connected? I'm sorry, forgive my geography here, but
very connected. Yeah.
I didn't want to quote something that was wrong, but they're having a massive. A lot of it is going underwater, right? Yeah. Don't they have like a flood season?
They have a massive flood season, and the bad part is people can't just up and move. Like here, we're very mobile. We move all the time. There, it's like people have been in one tract of land for generations. Yeah. And their whole livelihood is tied to that land. So when you say, the impact of climate change, it's A, millions of people, because population density is like off the charts, and B, they have no option. They cannot just up and move. So we're this like, it's just like all the perfect, orientation for things to go really bad.
Well, it's a human crisis.
It is, 'cause,
it's a different type of disaster, but
yeah, think about Syria. We're so worried about, we should be, but it's 3 million people. Like, looking at the scale, 3 or so million people are going to Europe, and they're overburdened. Imagine 35 million people from one country, and then there's others that are going to have to, So for the world, I mean, this is it's quite a daunting challenge, and it's easy to just be like, well, just be like, oh, we can't do much. This is crazy. But we've been through like tougher times. I think that I saw op-eds all the time about World War II and the industrial machine in America, how they just turned things around because there was a huge need that people understood. And I feel like with the things happening in the UN, with Greta that come into the U.S., I mean, the next generation is very aware, and they may not know exactly what to do, but they know that they want to do it.
Isn't the relationship between Bangladesh and India one of those where I don't know if it would get to the point of conflict, but I think a lot of the water that flows to Bangladesh comes from India, and that was actually, well, which by the way is a whole nother environmental issue.
Right.
But I mean, gosh, they're literally. I sometimes see the news about what they're trying to do in the Ganges. They're like thought about deploying flesh-eating turtles because people dump dead people.
Yeah,
and
I'm like, my God, ritual,
yeah, I know, but
like
man,
1 billion people.
Yeah,
that they use that for whatever.
And I saw another thing too related to India, where there's a lot of people that, all right, this is a weird topic. They like to poop outside.
Yeah.
And the problem is that washes into the public waterways.
Yeah.
And it creates a whole nother environmental issue.
Exactly. And billions have been deployed on like water projects, but
Mm-hmm.
it's just not sticking because it's not as impactful as people thought on paper.
And like you said, I think India did commit like a huge sum of money, and that wasn't really making progress the way that it was.
And even we have water.org here locally that's doing a lot of cool things in India, but the sheer massive scale of 1 billion people, in a country where the infrastructure wasn't really designed for 2019 1 billion citizens, it's a beast of its own. But Bangladesh, it's just a perfect storm of not being able to react quickly, not being responsible for the emissions that are ultimately affecting their landmass, and just the geopolitical problems that we can expect, being in that region.
We talked about the hard part getting people to care.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these countries have a different they just have a different economic outlook on certain things, and the population as a whole might not make the same kind of money, and so now you look at two-wheeled vehicles. So when I go to the Philippines, like, everyone's riding scooters. Like, when I say scooters, they're really more like dirt bikes.
Yeah.
And these things they spit out pollution.
Yeah, and I think Ace Wagner was here.
Yeah, he was. And that's what we were just talking about with Ace. And look back at the I can't remember, I don't know what episode number, it will have already come out by the time this one comes out, but they make a carburetor product that is, but the problem that they've got is, you look at most of these bikes that people are buying, they're $1,000 US, and this is an $800 solution.
Yeah, exactly.
So I said, you got to try to get people to care, and then you have to, and so one of the things that is that Dynamhex, and once again, go check that out, dynamhex.com. They're also on Twitter and LinkedIn. You can find them there. By the way, while you're out there on the internet, check us out at Startup Hustle Podcast on Instagram or on YouTube. But how do you work with cities to help them understand the supply chain issues? Because one of the things we talked about with Ace was, like, when someone's vehicle breaks, they don't want to wait for the repair. Like, hey, let me get this eco-friendly thing in for you, and it's like a whole nother. The supply chain is tough. Like, how do you get that in? How do you keep it in stock? One of the things that I think they were hoping to do was possibly see support from larger multinational, like the UN or just something, just like large, something to supplement that cost. So how do you guys work with the supply chain issues that come up with all these problems?
Yeah, so we're targeting, chief sustainability and resilience officers within American cities that have ordinances out saying, hey, we have, we have the goals of making, 30% reduction of emissions by this year. So for them, their departmental goals are very, specific. And what they want to do now is, instead of like hoping they meet it somehow, because they don't really have the tools or the engagement metrics to tell you, for instance, hey, this is what you should be doing, Matt. Since they don't have that, we provide that avenue by saying, okay, your goals are 30%. 12% could come from buildings, and here are the 10 big commercial people you could talk to. These are companies. And they have their own goals, right? They have their own sustainability goals. And these are big brands, and they're like, okay, if I reduced my emissions by 10%, it helps KC reduce it by 2, or something like that. So we're now dealing with specifics. We're dealing with specific projects. We're dealing with specific metrics. We're with specific timelines. So now both the chief sustainability officer and resilience folks within a corporation can talk to each other, be like, okay, so by in the next 2 years, let's try considering this project together. And this is happening all across the U.S. Bloomberg Philanthropies funded like $70 million in terms of helping 25 cities do just this. Bill Gates funded the Breakthrough Energy venture, where they're like, okay, how do we get cities and bigger municipal governments to really see what they're up against and what they should do? So people are talking about different aspects of it. We just tie it all together with one dashboard, one guy signing in and being, okay, well, this is cool. I now know what my ordinance means, and these are the 10 projects that I'm going to spend the next quarter looking over.
How challenging is it to keep up with all that stuff? Because, you're talking about ordinance, and so I don't even have any idea how many cities or municipalities there are in the United States. It's
346, actually.
346
cities.
Okay,
in the
cities.
US,
but each of them have, okay, so that's cities, but what classifies as a city? Because, is Derby, Kansas?
So there's incorporated and unincorporated cities. The 346 are actually cities with a council and a mayor, and a sizable population.
So that's not as many as I thought.
No, there's more that are considering it, but these 350 or so cities probably account for like 70% of the GDP. Right?
Okay.
So it's like big California cities, Texas, New York, Florida.
And those are the ones where we can make the biggest impact the fastest. Sure.
There's a thing called America's Pledge, funded by Michael Bloomberg, which is basically, after the feds pulled out of Paris, which cities still need to be in order to make a dent. And so that's, cities are big enough to make an impact, and there's a way to measure what that impact is, and people are doing that right now.
Yeah, we said we wouldn't get political, so I'm not going to comment on that one.
Yeah, it's more.
I do just honestly. I struggle with the fact that this isn't a political topic. It's a global issue.
Absolutely.
And I always like to look at myself, and I think everyone should, as a global citizen. And this isn't just about fixing USA.
Yeah.
It's about it is all tied together, and any country, anywhere. It's really gross out there, man. You just look at so much stuff. Think about it. There is a garbage patch the size of Texas floating in the Pacific Ocean. Wrap your arms around that, people, and tell me if you think that's if there's anything okay with that. And
crazy.
And then so many of the other things. Well, and once again, man, I really commend you for taking action and being a leader. It's important. It's important. So what do you think that the world of startups are going to be able to do a better job at? What can startups in general do? Because here's the thing: is it's tough to start a business. It's even tougher to start a business that doesn't necessarily have a short range bullseye on profitability.
Right. Yeah, and that's.
Because if you're an investor and I come pitch you and I'm like, I'm going to change the world, Sonny. I am going to do this. I'm going to do that, and I need $5 million from your fund to make this happen. And you're going to say, man, I really love what you're doing, and I have a lot of respect for it, but this isn't for me right now.
Yeah, this is not what. Yeah.
So how do we solve that problem?
Yeah, and I think so going back to what startups can do broadly, I think the example of having a energy efficiency policy out there that's kind of fluffy and till 2030, 2050, and then Nest being the vehicle through which that takes place. So if you give startups the metrics and you attach a pain point to it, which is what I described with the sustainability officers, then startups are now able to frame the problem, create a solution, and work to scale it. And I personally don't believe that climate change is so far out there that you can't put it in that framework. I think you can, and there are successful startups doing that today in the climate change sphere. Going up to an investor and pitching, hey, this is what we want to do, we want to change the world in 2050, that's not necessarily our approach. Our approach is basically we're helping cities today. They are going to council tomorrow. They have a pain point where they can't really tell the wider citizenry that this is what we're doing. They're doing some great things. They're deploying millions of dollars worth of projects, but not having the ROI because people don't get it. People don't get why this is important. So once you create that framework that I just talked about in a more SaaS model way, where every year you get to update the modules, you get to really provide them these services, then it's not just about climate change. It's about organizational performance, and it just happens to be climate change, but it's at that point like any other product.
I think this is something that honestly, it scares the shit out of me. I mean, just the whole thing. Like I said, there's just a lot of gross stuff out there. I mean, like this, I'm not kidding. The garbage patch.
Yeah,
it's that is ridiculous.
I mean, one guy, an economist, once said that our world is finite. The resources are finite, and there's no infinite growth. Every time you want to grow, that makes sense in terms of money. You can have a high growth company and grow forever in theory, but you cannot do that with services to people. The more people, if they have 8 billion people, guess what? They're gonna at some point be pushing the limits, and that's just reality.
We're already pushing them.
We already pushed them. We started pushing them probably a decade ago.
I didn't realize that we were here in Kansas facing desertification.
Isn't that crazy? A lot of people in Kansas City wouldn't even consider. They're like, well, we're not gonna get flooding from the sea. They're like, yeah, but that's not all climate change does.
But here's the issue. You know how much of your food comes from this state and the surrounding areas? How much of your
paycheck comes from the coast?
If they dry up, it's a problem, people. I mean, you're talking about a lot of corn, wheat, soy, all that stuff. I mean, and for those of you that haven't been to Kansas, there is Kansas City, which is sitting there on the border of Kansas and Missouri. Yeah. And if you drive about 30 miles west, it is an entire state filled with crops. Yeah. Filled with crops for a lot. And Nebraska, same way. Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of those states, Iowa, just the whole Midwest is so centric around that. And if that goes away and that becomes problematic, and that's another thing too. We've done just been trying to get interesting entrepreneurs and people in here, just talk about just different things. Like we've done a series on hemp and cannabis, and we're going to be doing a lot of clean tech stuff as we host the different companies that Black and Beach got involved with in the launch KC Clean Tech startup. Yep. And the thing is I do believe that we as entrepreneurs and founders and just people can take care of this, but it's one piece at a time. Yeah. I love what you're doing, man. And once again, if you get a chance, go to Dynamhex. You can look up Sunny Sanwar on the Google. I'm sure we can find you somewhere. And what do you have anything you'd like to say on the way out? Any words of encouragement or anything we can do to support what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, like you just said, check us out. It's an exciting time. It's not a long-term horizon. There are things you could do today. There are ways you can get engaged, and I think it's an exciting time. I'd like to think of it as a very exciting time where we have the ability to play a big role instead of thinking about the likelihood of those goals leading to something good or bad.
Think of how cool the comeback story is on this one.
Absolutely. You're down 4 and there's only 30 seconds left, and you're like, okay, well this. I like these kinds of challenges. It's like the 9 points in 7 seconds
comeback or something, and that's the thing is I think it does require a lot of teamwork. Well, thank you very much for coming in. Once again, if you want to check out Fullscale, go to fullscale.io. You can see the video version of this on our YouTube channel. Find us on Instagram at Startup Hustle Podcast. Sunny's business is easy to find at Dynamhex.com. That's Dynamhex.com. You can look him up on Twitter and LinkedIn. Do him a favor and send a link to what he does to someone that is in local government or doing something and just say, hey, check this out. Anyway, see you next time.
Thanks, Matt.